Great. Hello, everyone. I am Shamoyia Gardiner, Executive Director of Strong Schools Maryland, and this is Navigating Annapolis, the Maryland General Assembly and state legislative process. This is an introductory guide sort of training. I'm going to give you some insider knowledge about how to navigate the legislative process and also just really ground you in why it is that the General Assembly is here. That will be key to supporting your advocacy efforts, whatever they may be, wherever they may lie in education and beyond. So let's go ahead and get started. I'll share a little bit more about myself just so you all understand why it is that I might even be qualified to be talking to you about this subject. So I'm originally from Miami, Florida, was born to an immigrant from Jamaica who got pregnant at a young age. Yes, statistically speaking, I'm not supposed to be here. And frankly, that helped drive me in a lot of ways. I always recognized the value of public education, saw it as important, even though I attended Title I schools that unfortunately, in a lot of instances, were underfunded in a systemic manner. I benefited from the generosity of folks who were trying to do their bit to make things better, and that included advocates, that included philanthropists and folks in my community. So thanks to a confluence of beautiful things, I was able to attend the University of Florida as the first person in my family to do so. From there, I did teach for America in Jacksonville. I helped to found an all-boys public charter school, and the photo on the screen right now is actually of me and Ryan, one of my former students. I got him when he was a 6th grader, but I think he was in the 7th grade here. And there, I really brought together two things I'd always loved. I had some interest in political science. It's what I studied at school, but I also recognized that education wasn't functioning the way that it should. Unfortunately, my school closed, as many public charter schools often do within the first 5 years, and my students were scattered about one of the largest cities in the US in terms of land mass, Jacksonville, Florida. It takes about an hour to get from one end to the other by car. And that means that I now have no way of going back to see my students. That reaffirmed my drive to affect change in education policy so that things like what happened to my school in Jacksonville would not be allowed to continue happening. And in 2016, I found my way to Baltimore, and began working at the Family League in early 2017, where I did policy ranging from prenatal and pre-birth supports for mothers and pregnant folks, all the way ranging into college and career readiness, and what happens once you're done occupying these systems like public education. I went on to become the Education Policy Director for Advocates for Children and Youth before joining Strong Schools Maryland as Deputy Director, and I'm very, very proud now to be Executive Director and have the opportunity to continue that very important work. So about the organization, we envision a Maryland that leads the nation in funding public education equitably, achieving equitable student outcomes, and building strong relationships between directly impacted stakeholders and school leaders themselves. And that means that our mission is about advocating, building power, and sharing resources with invested Marylanders so that we can together co-create strong public schools that equip graduates equipped to thrive. So in 2017, the organization actually got started. We were founded in response to the formation of the Kirwan Commission, which is that group that eventually made recommendations that became the law we now know as the Blueprint for Maryland's Future. It focuses on early childhood education, high quality and diverse teachers and school leaders, new college and career readiness pathways, more resources to ensure that all students succeed, and of course, strong governance and accountability systems. The Blueprint is the opportunity to build that new system of world-class schools that we all have the capacity to envision. So as you are learning about how to navigate Annapolis and you are continuing your own advocacy, remember there are some existing things in place to support the work that you will be taking on. So where are we headed? We are going to have a quick overview of the General Assembly. We'll talk a little bit about the legislative process, but from an advocate's perspective, we'll touch on the policy cycle and then talk briefly about some things that are really, really key for you to consider as you go about getting involved. And as we go ahead and begin this work, it's important that we ground ourselves in what practitioners and folks who have been doing this work for a while, moving towards educational equity and justice, want us to know. And that's that we're trying to help our students leave our schools and make the world a better place in all the things that we do. And that means we cannot keep repeating the same history. Dr. Gholdy Muhammad meant this in the context of actual educating students in the classroom in terms of literacy, but when it comes to us who are attempting to interact with these foremost policymakers and the folks who actually control the systems that impact individual lives, it is very, very important that we remember we don't have to do things the way that they have always been done in the past. All right. So let's locate ourselves. This is a very, very top-down view of what government structures look like in the United States. We are located right here in legislative functions of state government. This means that your advocacy to the General Assembly will be specific. It will not be about any traffic issues on your local corner. It'll be about these far-ranging issues that impact broad constituencies across the state. So MDGA, Maryland General Assembly, let's learn a little bit about why they even exist. The foremost responsibility of the General Assembly is a constitutional obligation, and that is to pass a balanced state budget. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a second, but it is very, very important that you remember this is the only thing the General Assembly is constitutionally required to do. Every bit of the more than 2,000 bills that they take up each year is in addition to that one simple responsibility, and any bills you potentially introduced are also brought in at that same level of honor and prestige. So respect the process and recognize that all of this is driven by additional motivation beyond just a constitutional obligation. So the General Assembly also exists as a legislative check on the powers of the executive and judicial branches. That is, of course, the governor's office and the agencies reporting directly to the governor and the courts. And then, of course, the individual members of the General Assembly have personal motivations for doing the work they do every single year, be it to simply make policy change, address their constituents' needs, or maintain power. And it could be maintaining power for the sake of an individual holding on to a very, very critical seat, or it could be maintaining power by holding on to that seat to represent a community and their interests and their needs. And it's very important that we consider why it is that the folks in the General Assembly are there to do their work as we look to interacting with and advocating to them. So what is the General Assembly actually doing beyond passing this balanced state budget, which must be done in partnership with the governor, who has the authority to introduce the budget every year? The General Assembly is also responsible for, as individual members and as a collective body, introducing legislation. They caucus around very specific priorities, and we'll talk a little bit more about caucuses in a moment. They engage in committee and floor debates with their colleagues, some of whom they do have very personal relationships with. And that means that they may be inclined to like certain folks, or they may be very disinclined to like certain of their colleagues. And it's really important that we have that understanding as well as we're working with them. The members of the General Assembly also go about the work of actually lobbying their colleagues, even though we don't typically think of them when we think of what a lobbyist is. And ultimately, it's really important we keep in mind that one of the things members of the General Assembly are doing, especially during their time in Annapolis, is meeting with constituents, with lobbyists, and with advocates. And sometimes one person can be all of those things, and sometimes those are all very individual, different constituencies. So in this photo to the far right, you'll see an example. This is Baltimore County State Senator Shelley Heddleman. I think she was a delegate back then, meeting with some folks who were team leaders and advocates with Strong Schools Maryland, and that is during the legislative session. So don't ever feel intimidated that you going to Annapolis or reaching out and requesting a meeting with someone who represents you or represents a large constituency on an issue that impacts you, don't ever feel like you don't have the right to reach out to them. It is a part of their responsibility to be engaging with you as they are doing all these multiple other things. That's why they've got staff. All right, where is the work of the General Assembly taking place? Clearly, Annapolis, Maryland. And here we've got an image of some of the major cities across the state. From Baltimore City to Annapolis, it's only about a 45-minute drive without traffic. But if you live in Cumberland or Hagerstown, it's a significantly larger undertaking to come to Annapolis, which is another thing to keep in mind. More specifically, once you get to the city of Annapolis, you're looking at State Circle. There are a couple of buildings where most of the business of the General Assembly gets done. First is the House Office Building, which we'll see an image of in just a moment. The Senate Office Building, which is located directly across the street from the House. They actually face each other. And the State House, which is located a little further up the street and more central. And that is also where the governor's office is and where the two chambers for the House and Senate actually meet to cast their floor votes and have those floor debates. There are also additional events that take place around State Circle within the vicinity of those buildings that we've just talked about. Immediately prior to the legislative session, those are usually fundraising events. During session, they can be individual meetings for coffee, where folks are having really, really critical conversations about the work at hand. So don't assume that just the places that are designated as being the places of business, don't assume that the only places that critical work gets done and where your advocacy may make a difference. When is the work of the Maryland General Assembly at its peak? So technically speaking, we're looking at the second Wednesday in January. That is what we call opening day, the first day of session, and it'll run until sine die, which is the second Monday in April. And every legislative session goes on for 90 days. That means that this upcoming year, opening day will be on January 12th, sine die on April 11th. There are a couple notable exceptions. Clearly in the 2020 legislative session, the session adjourned early in March rather than in April due to the coronavirus pandemic. That was only the second time the General Assembly had adjourned its activities early. The first time was the Civil War. And of course, sometimes the General Assembly has a special session, which means they are meeting outside of that designated January to April timeframe. And that is usually to deal with really, really critical issues at the moment that require an immediate legislative response and cannot wait for the normal activities of a regular session. Redistricting is an example of this. There's a lot of expectation that we'll see a redistricting special session this December. Theoretically, it's also possible for the General Assembly to respond to widespread crisis with a special session and by passing emergency legislation. This photo you see right here is actually some advocacy that we took on in the 2021 legislative session, which was also affected by the coronavirus pandemic, where we could not have many constituents come to Annapolis to do lobbying, and we got some cardboard cutouts to represent them and their interests and remind legislators of who they were fighting for. So who actually comprises the General Assembly? We'll start with a macro view. In the course of your advocacy, depending on the organization you might be affiliated with, for example, if you're affiliated with a C3, there are certain ethical guidelines around how we talk about politics and policy and political parties as well. In this instance, this is a purely nonpartisan, factual view of what the structure of the Maryland General Assembly currently looks like. So in the Senate, where there are 47 seats, one for every legislative district in the state, we've got a majority of Democrats, and in the House, we also have a majority where there are 141 Democrats in the House of Delegates, as opposed to, I'm sorry, there are 141 total members of the House of Delegates, 99 Democrats, 42 Republicans in the House, 32 Democrats in the Senate, and 15 in the Senate. So that is one way that the members of the General Assembly might define themselves or align themselves. Party caucuses are legitimate things, and we'll see that as we look to the structure of the leadership of the General Assembly. Another very real identifier is caucuses. So there are 5 statutorily recognized caucuses in the General Assembly: the Legislative Asian American and Pacific Islander Caucus, the Legislative Black Caucus of Maryland, the Maryland Legislative Latino Caucus, the Maryland Veterans Caucus, and the Women Legislators of Maryland, which we commonly refer to as the Women's Caucus. These are groups that are clearly grouped up around their shared identities and would theoretically then pursue policies, initiatives, and shifts in the law that benefit or meet the needs in some way of the constituency that shares that identity. They are really, really critically important groups. The Black Caucus in Maryland in particular is renowned across the nation. So let's look a little bit deeper at who the General Assembly is, starting with Senate leadership. The president of the Senate is Bill Ferguson from Baltimore City. His president pro tem, we don't use the term vice president, but Senator Melvin Griffith would actually step in to support the work of the legislative process were Senator Ferguson unable to make it for some reason. There is a majority leader. The majority in this case is Democrats, that is Nancy King, and a majority whip, and this is the person responsible for ensuring that there are appropriate numbers of votes for certain activities to move forward. These folks would ideally work together to advance the priorities of the majority, and then the minority leader, Senator Brian Simon from Anne Arundel County, and the minority whip would work together to advance the priorities of the minority party. It is worth saying that the current minority whip, Michael Huff, has already indicated he will not be running for this seat again, so we will see a new one in the Senate relatively soon. Beyond leadership, there are the individual committees that do the work of the General Assembly. They're listed here. There are just 6 in the Senate, and a picture of their chair is next to each of them. So beginning on the left, that's Senator Guy Gazzoni from Howard County. Beneath him and then to the right is Senator Pinsky, and so on and so forth. 6 committees in the Senate. Keep that in mind as we look at the House. So House leadership is comprised of the Speaker, Speaker Adrian Jones. We have a Speaker pro tem in Delegate Cherie Sample Hughes as well. She represents several jurisdictions on the Eastern Shore, and much like Senator Griffith would step in to continue operations if for some reason Speaker Jones were unable to preside. There's also a majority leader and a majority whip, much like in the Senate, same for the minority leader and minority whip. And due to the composition of the General Assembly, it happens again that the majority are Democrats, the minority are Republicans, and they would work to advance the individual causes of their groups, and ideally all work together. The House has several additional committees when compared to the Senate, and this is in part due to the significantly larger membership of the House. On some of these committees, Ways and Means, for example, which is chaired by Ann Kaiser, whose photo is to the left, that committee has several subcommittees that then break up the very, very broad work. Ways and Means covers a number of topics from education to racing and gaming, election law, early childhood, and so on. So in order to ensure that the many delegates have opportunities to impact the process, and also that there is specific attention being paid to aspects of the work, the committee structure is extremely helpful in the House. When we are looking at advocating to folks in the General Assembly, it is so important to make note of which committee they sit on, because as folks will tell you, they have no problem telling you if you ask them about something that they are not an expert in, they're not going to have a very good answer. The meeting may not be productive. So be sure to do your research ahead of time to make sure that you've got the right individual with the right amount of power, and also the right experience to help guide you as you're working through the process of advocating for some policy or another. This is a little bit of an insider's tip. We don't often talk about the Department of Legislative Services, or DLS, but they are some of my favorite people in Annapolis, and without them, the General Assembly would not be able to function. Simply would not be able to carry out any of their many responsibilities, because what DLS provides is essentially institutional knowledge. They are what I refer to as the librarians of the state legislature in COMAR, which is the Maryland State Code. It is our laws. They actually do the work of drafting legislation. So say you have a policy idea, but you don't know how to word it exactly, or how to get the formatting on the page right so that it looks like a bill. They are the individuals that go through and make those technical changes. They serve as a primary information source. They have tons of data that they've collected and analyzed based on specific priorities of the General Assembly for every single bill that is introduced. And this, again, can be thousands of bills in the span of 90 days. DLS provides a fiscal and policy note or report, which is very, very helpful when we're debating legislation, when we see legislators making hard decisions in comparison to what's available in the budget. Those fiscal and policy notes tell us what the projected cost of a policy change might be, how much we might save, what other laws exist that may interact with the shifts that we're trying to make, etc., to really ensure that the General Assembly is able to make responsible, informed decisions as they go about their work. And one of the newer exciting things is that, beginning with bills introduced in the House Judiciary and the Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee, racial equity impact assessments will also be provided, much like a fiscal note, to analyze the potential impact and even unintended consequences of a policy on a specific racial group, to ensure that we're not advancing systemic inequity as we continue policymaking. This image here is actually from a meeting of the Kirwan Commission. Again, the folks who helped create what is now the blueprint for Maryland's future. And the chair, Dr. Kirwan, is sitting next to a woman named Rachel Heiss, who had been with the commission since the start of its work and knows effectively everything about the blueprint as a law. And she is a walking encyclopedia on this subject, literally the state's foremost expert, and she is right there in the Maryland Department of Legislative Services. So finally, we get to how. What is this legislative process? We know who the actors are, what their motivations could potentially be, what's required of them, but what actually happens in that 90-day period? And I thought I'd simplify it for you. So first, to the left, we have an image of the House office building in the middle, the Senate office building, and off to the right, the State House itself, which we discussed earlier. And let's say that you had an idea to add an additional $5 million to the state budget to ensure that arts education is available to every single student in the state at no cost. And let's just forgive the generality there. Say that bill is introduced and the House Ways and Means Committee hears it and they say, that's an excellent idea. We are going to give that bill our stamp of approval. And in fact, it's so great. We're going to pass it out of this committee and we're going to send it all the way over to the House floor, where all the other members of the House of Delegates who are not in the Ways and Means Committee can also hear about the bill, debate it, and help us advance this. And ultimately, let's say that the entire House of Delegates agrees with that Ways and Means Committee. Yep, arts education is critical. We approve this. And then this very, very interesting thing called crossover happens. Because in order for any bill to become a law in Maryland, it must go through both chambers, both the House and the Senate. So once the House has approved this, said this is a really good idea, let's send it over to our friends in the Senate in the Education, Health, and Environmental Affairs Committee chaired by Senator Pinsky. So that committee hears it and they're like, oh my gosh, absolutely. We love the arts so much. This is a fantastic idea. Let's tell the rest of the Senate about it too. See if we can get this moving. It heads back to the State House where the Senate hears it. And miraculously, everyone's like, this is our top priority. Yes, we totally agree. Then we move the bill ahead for final passage. And theoretically, within 30 days, if passed within the legislative sessions period, the governor would then sign. And that would be a law. That is not how every single bill works its way through the legislative process. There are intensely more junctures at which things can pause and become complicated. There are amendments. What happens if the House amends a bill one way and the Senate amends it another? They have to come to conference committee before we can even get to final passage to make sure that the language agrees and that both houses actually agree on what's going on. But ultimately, in its most simplified version, this is how the legislative process can work. Something we saw with the blueprint, which depending on the environment you're advocating in is something to be cautious of, is we got a veto. Off to the side of the State House is actually the governor's mansion. And as we said earlier, the governor's offices are actually also located within the State House. So say we get a veto, there has to be a little back and forth. The General Assembly can override a governor's veto with certain majorities. And again, a lot of this is dependent on the timing, whether these activities are happening during the legislative session or after a legislative session has concluded, also may limit the ability of the General Assembly to impact a veto in a way that they'd like to. So for a moment here, I want us to, again, try to locate ourselves and consider where we are. This is the policy cycle. So in that example we just went through, saying that we wanted to pass a bill to fund arts education with another $5 million, we have already identified a problem, arts education being underfunded, likely already done the analysis to say $5 million would be a good solution, gone through the strategy and policy development to ensure that it's moved its way through the legislative process. We've done our research, etc. And the work in the General Assembly, that process we just narrated, is actually the policy enactment. So we've gone through stages about 1 through most of 4 so far. And throughout this entire process, what is key is that stakeholder engagement and education, those folks we are advocating in partnership with, directly impacted folks who would benefit from our policy ideas, etc., that we are in continuous conversation with them, multi-directional conversation, that we're continuing to keep them updated on what's going on, and that we're evaluating whether what we are doing is the correct idea, is the appropriate solution to move forward based on the new information that we get at every stage in the process. So remember that, and we'll get to policy implementation more towards the end. So a couple of things as we got a little bit more narrow and focus more neatly within the legislative process. Critical things here are the bill. And when you are thinking about a bill idea, it is so critical that you have a good one. You recognize that there's a need that requires meeting and that state legislative policy is a good solution. A lot of the things we initially think require these grand legislative options or things that could be fixed with administrative or regulatory policy. So make sure that the idea is appropriate for where it is being introduced. Does it need to impact the entire state of Maryland, or does it need to impact one individual school system? Are there stakeholders who have agreed that your ideas are good, etc.? Once you've got your idea and you know you'd like to advance some sort of legislation in the General Assembly, you want to find a sponsor. Of course, no one person can be an expert in every issue. Be open to who your sponsor is. It might not be someone who has been an arts education champion in the past, but it might be someone who really, really knows the process and their colleagues and can help maneuver your bill to be in a position to pass. So keep that in mind. And as I highlighted earlier, in the simplified version of the legislative process, the bill has to cross over. It has to pass in both chambers, and a really good way to ensure that that happens from the outset is to get a co-sponsor or a cross-sponsor. So someone from the other house, if you have a delegate sponsoring a bill, you want to get a senator to sponsor an exact copy of that bill and run those two bills through the process simultaneously. There are a couple instances where you may not need to do that. If you have a bill and it's sponsored by Senate President Ferguson, odds are your bill's going to pass, you know? So maybe you don't necessarily need to have a House sponsor. It might be a priority, especially if it's introduced as Senate Bill number 1. But that's not always going to be the case, and it is helpful more often than not to have a cross-file bill. You also want to keep in mind that the elected officials are not the only people who make the General Assembly work. We've already highlighted this with DLS, and this picture is up here to really highlight the importance of legislative staff. So on the outer ends on the left is Delegate Stephanie Smith from Baltimore City and Delegate Robin Lewis, also of Baltimore City, and in between them are their respective chiefs of staff at the time. It's really, really important that you get to know the folks who are doing the work to ensure that your sponsor looks good, that your bill has a great odds of passing, and that you all are in constant communication with one another. If you request a meeting with an elected official and you get a staffer, that is a sign of a serious commitment, especially if it is a staffer who has some expertise in the issue that you wanted to talk about. It may just be that the potential sponsor didn't. I mentioned DLS earlier. Those are the folks who are drafting bills. Making bill drafting as easy a process as possible is very, very helpful. The folks at DLS have thousands of bill ideas to work through within a very, very short time period. So as clear as you can be about the intent of what you want the bill is, let them know in advance. There are instances sometimes where there are miscommunications with drafting a bill, and it is very, very disappointing to get a bill back that does the exact opposite of what you want it to, causes a whole bunch of confusion, and that can really be headed off by having good relationships and being very, very clear with the folks over at DLS. And then finally, you want educational materials on your bill, because not all of the work is happening in the office of your sponsor. It is happening in the folks you are mobilizing, the other elected officials on the committees of jurisdiction that you'll be educating, the general public if it's a really big campaign, and so on. So keep these things in mind as you are thinking about just the bill. When you are not leading on a bill, you might just be tracking legislation that's introduced to keep an eye out. Maybe you're on the defensive and you're looking to ensure that bad bills don't pass. One of the things you're going to need to do is create a My MGA account. This is a relatively recent development. This is an updated online bill tracker embedded in the General Assembly's website. It is one of the best places that you can go, and best of all, it is free to create an account. Once you've created an account and logged in, you will see this tab pop up. It will be on the left-hand side of your screen when it does. And these are some of the functions that you can go through as a constituent in the state of Maryland that help you navigate the process. You can create lists to help you track bills. You can get those lists updated every day when new bills are introduced. You can tag a couple of them so that you can monitor their progress and decide if you're going to do any actions around them. There's a section for witness sign up, which is where you would actually go and sign up for testimony. During the 2021 legislative session, when things were online, this is where we would sign up for virtual public comment. We don't know how things are going to proceed, but are extremely hopeful that the General Assembly is going to allow virtual public comment to continue, again, especially in light of how far some Marylanders might have to travel in order to ensure their voices are heard. There's a frequently asked questions page to help guide you through the relatively new website, and a few more account maintenance options. So before you go into a hearing, regardless of whether it is for a bill that you're championing or a bill that you're looking to defeat, it is very, very important that you do your research. So this is yet another still from the General Assembly's website. In the upper right-hand corner, you'll see that search box. You type in a bill number there. It will have to be in the form of HB, whatever the number is, or SB, whatever the number is, in order for you to find it. But every bill should have a page that looks like this. It might be in various states of being updated and edited during the legislative session because it's real-time work. But once you look under the progress bar where all the check marks are, you'll see the title, you'll see who sponsors it, the current status of the bill. There, under analysis, is a fiscal and policy note I referenced earlier that the Department of Legislative Services provides. That is critical information. It is a very good idea to read through a fiscal and policy note before the hearing on a bill to ensure that you have an understanding of the broader impacts of the proposed legislation. It is not always possible, again, because DLS is staffed by real people and there are a lot of bills they have to keep up with, but do your best to keep updated on the status of those fiscal and policy notes before you go in. There's also a brief summary. When a bill hearing has already passed, you'll be able to watch a video recording of it. And there is also a little bit more information about whether bills have been cross-filed, who provided testimony, and if you click that drop down all the way at the bottom by history, it'll tell you a little bit about the voting record on the bill. So there's tons of information and valuable at all stages of the advocacy process, whether you're in the middle of session, looking back, or looking ahead. The hearing itself. Scheduling is very, very important. So keep an eye on the General Assembly website for when new hearing dates are announced. There's a pretty regular schedule, but of course it's session and it's only 90 days and a lot of critical work has to get done. So some things may shift without being announced with much pomp and fanfare. It might be an 8:30 a.m. announcement as they're on floor that a committee hearing has been moved, and it is up to you to know the latest status of all things. It is also critical to be able to sign up for testimony. We talked about that a little bit already, but ensuring that you've got the testimony sign up within the appropriate time frame. There's usually a 24 to 48 hour waiting period ahead of the hearing date by which you would have had to sign up. Deciding on written testimony versus oral testimony. I like to say that written testimony is for the record. So if you've done a lot of really great research and you really want folks to know, regardless of time, that you have said these things and you knew these things in advance, written testimony is absolutely the way to go. I say that oral testimony is for the performance or for the show. It is also intensely valuable. It will also be on the record because the hearings are recorded and those recordings are archived. So much like written testimony is also for the record, but with oral testimony, legislators cannot go back and reference things. Folks who potentially want to be your allies cannot immediately go back and quote you. So it is always a very good idea to submit written testimony in combination with oral testimony. For the hearing itself, you're also going to want to mobilize supporter turnout because showing that you have large numbers of people who agree with the perspective you're taking and are willing to take time out of their day to come to Annapolis and testify on the issue and be seen as supporting the issue says so much. Legislators do not get the amount of interaction from constituents that you would think. There have been times where as few as 10 emails swayed an elected official's decision on a bill because that is how infrequently they may hear from constituents as they're attempting to do their work. So showing up for a hearing, ensuring that you're mobilizing your supporters at all stages of the process is always important. Even if you don't see other folks doing it, you are being seen, and that is critical. During the hearing, if any elected officials are asking questions of any of the witnesses, it's important to note what those questions are. That may help you learn a lot more about what those folks value and what it is they may need in order to vote for or against what you're advocating for. And it is also very critical that post-hearing you communicate with your bill sponsor and staff. We make the mistake of thinking sometimes that it's just the hearing and that's it. But very often, immediately after, subcommittees will meet, folks will continue to be speaking to one another on the issue, and you want to be in contact with your most inside contact to ensure that you can be supportive. And tracking subcommittee meetings is a really, really important way to do that. Ideally, they would all be posted on the General Assembly's website all the time. That does not happen. There are moves to ensure that that does happen. But a good thing to do is just to be in contact with whatever subcommittee chair's chief of staff on when the next subcommittee meeting may be. Depending on the chair of that subcommittee, folks, advocates included, may be invited to come answer questions or speak on certain points, or it may just be an opportunity to listen in and hear what folks are thinking on a subject and what their concerns are. Regardless, still extremely valuable. And here we do have Delegate Pam Queen testifying alongside some advocates on a really critical bill. So again, going to track hearings and meetings, you'll want to hit that meetings tab on the General Assembly website. It's third from the left, and you can track by individual days, weeks, or months. I prefer to go by weeks just to get a look at what will be going on during session. After the hearing, of course, keep your supporters informed and engaged. Your supporters are not just limited to folks who are not used to being in Annapolis. Sometimes your supporters are folks on the committee. You also want to follow up with them to help them figure out how they can be supportive on that issue. Email and phone are key to follow up. Social media is always great, especially if you're trying to keep a broad constituency who's not all there engaged on what's been going on. It's very important to monitor the flow of the bill throughout the legislative process and track this against deadlines. So if you have a bill that you've been fighting really hard for and it doesn't get introduced until February, which is closer to the end of the bill drafting deadline for the legislative session, it has significantly less time to go through the rest of the process. So, and it might happen that you have a hearing, but then nothing else happened with your bill for like 3 weeks. It's very, very important to keep track of where you are in the timeline and be in communication with folks in positions of power, your sponsor, any committee chairs, et cetera, about how the bill is flowing to ensure that you meet the deadlines that everyone in the General Assembly has to abide by. Also keep track of the news. Things in Annapolis don't happen in a vacuum. Opinion editorials will be published. You might want to publish a few of your own, but there may also just be legitimate factual events in the news that happen that impact what it is that you're fighting for. And it's important to keep current on those issues and potentially even be the one to bring any positive news to support your case to your sponsor and the members of the General Assembly. And as always, do what you can to maintain media interest. If you and your constituency, the folks you're advocating with, say that this is a big deal and are constantly ringing the doldrum, folks will take notice. And ideally, you know, give it the elevation that your particular advocacy requires. And it never hurts to take a photo after a hearing. You never know who you'll end up being in a picture with. So let's revisit the policy cycle. We have not yet talked about number 5, which is what happens after you've finished navigating Annapolis, after you've gotten to sine die and you have your wins and what you'll come back to next year, etc. It's really, really important to remember that navigating Annapolis is not the same thing as affecting systemic change at a state level. That requires in-depth work, that requires something like the policy cycle, which is continuous. Constantly asked, is this good enough? Is this working for folks who are being directly impacted? And what more can we learn to ensure that we get to the goals we set out with on this policy? Far too often we get the legislative victory and then we leave the issue alone. And several years later, we wonder why it is that the thing we wanted to see hasn't come to fruition. So gear up for policy implementation as well. A good way to start is to let folks know what issues you worked on once the session is over. Do a wrap-up report. Continue talking about what has happened, even though folks in Annapolis may not be meeting anymore. It is very, very important to get the word out and do public information so that folks understand that things will be shifting and what the intended goals are. That is one of the easiest ways to begin interacting with policy implementation. It is also very, very important to take another look at structures of government, because as I said earlier, we were functioning just in the legislative operations of state government. But when you pass a policy, things change, and implementation could require you to interact with the governor's office to release funds, maybe for arts education, or it might require some interaction with the courts to mandate action from a certain agency, or it may require additional legislative action. Say you said there was a $5 million grant program across the state, but local governments have to figure out exactly how they're going to ensure that disparately impacted communities don't negatively miss opportunities to benefit from the grants. And that is yet another potential route for advocacy through the lens of policy implementation. Ultimately, what is likely going to happen is that the focus is going to get narrower and narrower until we can begin to see the positive intended outcomes of the policies we've advocated for. That means some continued state work probably, but more likely than not, a lot of continued local and county level work. Be prepared for that. Recognize that it's a different phase and do the work necessary as an advocate to take care of yourself, so that you are then able to approach the new challenge with new eyes. So what can you do to get involved? Regardless of where you are in your advocacy journey right now, you might end up here someday. This day is a photo of President's Day in 2020, February 17th. There, the leaders of the Maryland General Assembly, the Senate President and House Speaker, are preparing to speak in support of a law that we had worked on for years. This was one of the very first blueprint hearings. It was a monumental event, and you may have one of your own, depending on how successful and far-reaching your advocacy efforts are, and the amount of intention and strategy that you are able to pour in. This moment exists in the potential future for all of us. And so does the reality that comes with implementation. So please, wherever you are, join in. This is an invitation. This is our government, our systems, our structures, our schools, and our world to impact. And great ways to get started are by joining with folks who have been doing this work. That can include coalitions, individual student groups, local organizing groups, and that's an immediate way to broaden your impact. I also personally recommend working with an intergenerational group of advocates who have had varied experiences. Students themselves, practitioners, directly impacted stakeholders, academics, what have you. There is so much to learn. There are many sides to an advocacy issue, and there is enough work out there for all of us to have a place in it. So I would not be me if I didn't make this pitch. Strong Schools Maryland is going to continue to do education advocacy. We're going to continue to partner with fantastic organizations like AEMS, and we hope that you will continue in joining us in this work. Find us at strongschoolsmaryland.org. Thank you so much for your time, and good luck out there.